Welcome to week 6 of PSHS 6240 here at George Washington's University Homeland Security Master's Program. Just start off with announcements. Adobe Connect, or I should probably say WebEx session. I think we had a really good WebEx session on Thursday. Kudos to Group 2 for doing a pretty good job. And what I'm going to say is that the next WebEx session, first Group 3 is in the chute, and I'm going to send you, along with this YouTube video, a Boston Marathon congressional report, which should be the core of your assignment. Group 3 pretty much has to read it because it's part of their assignment, and I would recommend everyone else read it, although I've made it optional, just because it has a lot to do with intelligence failure, intelligence structure, failures in structure, and failures in analysis, which will be part of your part of this week's assignment and part of your final. So, and I just want to add, at the WebEx session will be that Boston Marathon, and then I'm going to have a job talk as well. And as I mentioned in the last WebEx, please shoot me any questions you have about jobs, working in the federal government, etc., so I can research it and have an answer during that WebEx session. So paper 2, I don't know when you're watching this, but paper 2 is due pretty much now. I haven't gotten any excuses, so I'm looking forward to seeing it uploaded tonight at 11:59 p.m. or on Sunday 11:59 p.m. So current events. I want to touch on Kim Jong-un, North Korea, for a second. Rationality, irrationality. A lot of people have thought that Kim Jong-un is irrational, that we can't deal with him as if we're dealing with the Chinese or the Soviet Union back in the Cold War, because he's irrational, because he treats his people terribly, because he kills his brother in the Malaysian airport, because he puts people on firing squads with anti-aircraft guns. I think the events of this past week, and this is during the Winter Olympics, kind of belie that. I don't think Kim Jong-un is irrational. In fact, I think he's very rational. And the lesson I want you to take, and that's relevant to this course, is that you should never confuse brutality with irrationality. As we've seen in past terrorist groups, they have resorted to some very brutal tactics, but those tactics have led to a strategic objective. So while it might seem like they're crazy, even the 9/11 hijackers, even ISIS is crazy and irrational. Don't confuse, again, irrationality with brutality. And as a North Korea scholar would say, if Kim Jong-un wasn't brutal, it would be him on the firing squad, on the receiving end of the firing squad. It'd be him that's deposed. Politics for him is a blood sport. It's kill or be killed. And so what he's doing to stay in power is definitely rational. And what I think I'm seeing now with his participation in these Olympics is that he's trying to divide South Korea from the United States, which is a very strategic move. And if he's doing that, that is the definition of rationality. He's using his objectives or using his power to achieve an objective. His nuclear program, if he's using it to save his regime, that is the definition of being rational. So again, too many people, and I see it on the news, I see it on all sorts of politicians say it, they think Kim Jong-un is irrational because he's brutal. And never forget, again, sometimes brutality is necessary. So week 5 review, good review, good comments this past week in the strategy, counterterrorism strategy. Counterterrorism strategy US. So what's good, what's bad? And I think we've outlined that pretty well. I think you guys outlined it pretty well in your discussion sections. The one thing I'm going to ask as we go forward, if you do your paper on this, is, so we're now 1 year into the Trump administration, and I asked you to look at the Obama administration and later parts of the Bush administration. But as a Trump administration, where do we go now from terrorism? What would be a good counterterrorism strategy? And feel free to write a counterterrorism strategy for the Trump administration, using the lessons learned from what we talked about in the lecture previous years and what we've learned about for other countries as well. So that's a key point going forward. EU counterterrorism. We talked about that, and you saw that in the PBS Frontline. If you did not see the PBS Frontline Terror in Europe, watch it. It is excellent documentary. It's a sign, but if for some reason you couldn't get to it, please try and get to it this week. And the reason I bring it up is because it's a good lead-in to week 6 about counterterrorism and intelligence. And you saw in that video, I think a key point was a lot of the people involved in the 2015 Bataclan Theater attacks were on the radar screen of EU and French and Belgian intelligence. They were known, but you can't, as the commentator said in that documentary, you can't monitor someone 24/7. And this is going to bring us to a key problem in the post 9/11, or especially for week 6 as we study it. What do you do about people that are on the radar screen but haven't done enough to get arrested? And that's going to be key. The Fort Hood shooter, he was certainly on some people's radar screens. The Boston Marathon bombers, they were on the radar screen of U.S. intelligence. The Orlando shooter, he was known. He had been, an FBI investigation had been on him. But we can't do, and again, in a free country, what can you do? And that will be a part of week 6 that we will study. And hint, hint, stomp, stomp, that's something that would be a good point to address in your paper. What do you do for, again, that gap between they're on the radar screen, they have an investigation because they've expressed some interest in terrorism, but they haven't done enough to get arrested, and they can still go out and buy a gun, and they can still go out and buy materials needed to conduct attacks. So that's going to be a key point going forward. And again, it was discussed in that EU paper or EU documentary pretty in depth. And then Israeli comparisons. We talked about how Israel uses intelligence, how they use leadership targeting. One big thing that Israel does that the British do that I don't think we do is resiliency after an attack. Although after the events of this past fall, with what happened in New York, maybe we are getting more resilient. And what I mean by that is the attack occurs and the next day there's no implicit effect on the population. Everyone goes about their day-to-day business. People still ride on the metros and the trains and the buses. They still conduct their business. That attack in New York, the truck rolling over attack that killed 6 people, maybe we're getting inured to terrorism, as I brought out in the first week, and maybe that's a good thing. That happened at 2 o'clock, and by 10 o'clock, no one had canceled the Halloween parade in New York. Israel has done that for years. They've shown no impact, and they've been a very resilient society. Britain is better at being resilient after an attack. Up until recently, I don't think the United States was, and you could even see it, maybe not this past year, but in 2016, how we reacted to the Orlando shooting, how we reacted to the Boston Marathon. We shut down everything. We gave a lot of, our public officials went on air and said, you need to be scared, you need to be fearful. These things that happen in the United States, again, don't happen in Israel. And that's one thing I want you to take away from this strategy or from this international comparison going forward. So week 6 preview. Documentary work, lots of good documentaries out there. What I want you to do is read the last chapter in the 9/11 Commission report, the recommendations, what we need to do, and the question that you should be thinking about when reading that is, okay, how come, again, 12, 13 years after that report, we still have issues with information sharing and intelligence sharing? So that's something, again, keep in the back of your mind as you're going through that report. The National Geographic documentary, excellent 9/11 documentary, or the prelude to 9/11. what I want you to, again, as you're watching that, think about, okay, could those 9/11 hijackers have been intercepted if information sharing was a lot more cogent? And information sharing between federal agencies, information sharing between domestic and federal agencies, even information sharing between private civil aviation schools or even credit card companies and the private sector with the federal government. And I just want you to think through that as you're watching the National Geographic documentary. And could those 19 of people have been intercepted in some way? The Nova inside NSA, the first 35, 40 minutes are dedicated to 9/11 and the intelligence failures related to 9/11 from the NSA, National Security Agency perspective. Excellent, excellent documentary. The BBC document, another great one. That is on the underwear bomber. For those of you who don't remember, that's the Matulub who wanted to bomb the Northwest flight coming into Detroit on Christmas 2009. And that covers, again, the intelligence failures surrounding that. Or were they intelligence failures? I'll let you guys decide. And then finally, the Fort Hood report. I'm going to send out a link to a kind of a video summary of the Fort Hood report. But if you're reading the Fort Hood report, just read it enough so you can understand the intelligence failure surrounding Fort Hood. And what unfortunately I have to say now, the first Fort Hood shooting in 2009, because there was a second one back in 2014. But where did the system go wrong on Fort Hood? And again, what I want you to think through this is, again, when people show up on the radar screen, but there's not enough to arrest them, what can we do? And again, when we're talking about trying to counter lone wolves and radicalized individuals. So I look forward to reading your papers, and if there's any questions or issues, please let me know.